My analysis of the James Bond series continues with the 8th Eon-produced movie, Live and Let Die, released in 1973. After selecting the safest possible choice of actor to play the next James Bond, Roger Moore, producers Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman decided that his first movie outing as 007 should be in an adaptation of the most controversial of Ian Fleming's Bond novels. At the time of this video being recorded, the publishers of the novels have appointed so-called sensitivity readers to edit them, so as to avoid offending racial sensibilities or those who balk at the morals and values of past decades. Live and Let Die was the one that saw the most editing and was widely used as an example of what sensitivity readers do when the press got hold of the story. What makes Live and Let Die controversial is that it touches on race and racial issues. It is the second novel in the series and published in 1954, so it goes without saying that it is a product of its time. It is also quite advanced for its time in the themes and plot devices it uses. Fleming was concerned about a number of contemporary issues in 1954, such as the influence of the Soviet Union over various aspects of American life and culture, that the Soviets were exploiting the civil rights and black power movements to undermine the US from within by playing divide and rule, but also the malign influence of American money and culture on Jamaica and the West Indies in general by eroding local traditions and norms. He also, via the voice of James Bond, has doubts about America's social melting pot experiment. There is much to pick over about how racist or illiberal the novel actually is, or whether the criticisms are overstated. But in terms of the movie adaptation, Broccoli and Saltzman were very wise and canny and selected what worked in the novel, what wouldn't work for a 1970s film audience, and what amount of updating from 1954 would be needed for a successful Bond film, especially one that had to introduce a new James Bond to the audience. Being the canny producers that they were, Broccoli and Saltzman were able to bring Live and Let Die to the screen at just the right time, because the film industry had a new subgenre that was riding the crest of public popularity, and they were able to capitalise on it: blaxploitation. It had been only 2 years since the release of the very first movie of that genre, Shaft, and the impact that had on popular culture was still very much being felt in 1973. Shaft had propelled a number of black actors and, crucially for Live and Let Die, stuntmen into more mainstream entertainment. Blaxploitation not only gave black Americans heroes of their own to cheer on at the cinema, but it did so in a way that drew white audiences to it as well. It introduced a whole new look, new kinds of slang dialogue, and musical cues to Hollywood cinema that were picked up by primetime television shows, and now, in 1972 and 73, the world of James Bond. Ian Fleming's cynical view of black America from the 1950s would be replaced by the tropes of blaxploitation movies, giving a charisma to the villains and supporting characters in Live and Let Die, but also influencing the soundtrack of the film as well. John Barry's services were not retained for the film after he'd given the series probably the 3 best soundtracks in a row, and it came as a surprise that the score would be entrusted to the famed Beatles producer George Martin, and the theme song written and performed by Paul McCartney and his band Wings. Martin wasn't just a producer, he had trained as a composer and arranger and was a talented pianist as well. He had also developed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of different sounds and music traditions as well, and he brought this to bear in his work on Live and Let Die. He weaves in McCartney's title song, the James Bond theme, and the funk soul sound of early 70s blaxploitation to create his score. Whereas Barry used shock and awe for his soundtrack, Martin's work is used more to create moods and themes that suit the locations and story beats. In the New York and New Orleans locations, for example, there's more funk to the soundtrack. Also, there's no music for most of the boat chase, something that would be almost unheard of in a Bond movie scored by John Barry. Martin never lets his score overpower the story, merely to enhance either the action, where required, or the mood. The McCartney tune, when required, provides the shock and awe at the most dramatic moments. The accusation that the movie Live and Let Die is racist is mainly based on the fact that the villain characters are almost all black. But the counter-argument to that is simple. James Bond movies are high-prestige productions, especially after a decade of being consistent box office smashes, and that the 3 main ingredients the fans look for in a Bond film are James Bond himself, the Bond girl, and the Bond villain. Being the villain is very prestigious when you're up against James Bond. That's certainly how the actors felt when they were cast. Although blaxploitation movies were popular, the budgets were never that high. Compare the look of the first Shaft movie with its follow-up 2 years later, Shaft's Big Score, and you'll see the studio upped the budget considerably in the latter film. However, it was still comparatively small compared with a Bond movie. The production team was virtually the same as that on Diamonds Are Forever, as that movie had done well both commercially and critically, so now United Artists were happy to keep that side of the production in place. Broccoli was now the dominant partner at Eon, as Saltzman's own financial affairs began to suffer. Guy Hamilton was retained as director, and Tom Mankiewicz as primary scriptwriter. The latter two were there to keep the lightness of touch of Diamonds Are Forever going into Live and Let Die. Ken Adams swapped places with Sid Kane as art director, and Ted Moore would lens the movie with that same lushness and vibrancy of colour that he did with his first Bond movie, Dr. No. Broccoli had a keen eye for a plot hook that could be drawn from events in the world. In Diamonds Are Forever, he used the reclusiveness of Howard Hughes as inspiration for Willard White, and here in Live and Let Die, he turned to the Haitian dictator Papadoc Duvalier for inspiration for the Dr. Kananga character that would take place of the novel's Mr. Big. In doing so, the story would introduce voodoo and mysticism, and that would deal with Bond in mythological terms instead of the solid material world character the series had known so far. Back in my review of You Only Live Twice, I said that a problem with the movie's depiction of Bond was that he had become iconic, and so the whole production saw the character as a series of tropes designed to fulfill audience expectations. The novels had created a new gentleman spy British hero paradigm. The movies, starring Sean Connery, put flesh onto that and made stylistic choices to transform Bond into an icon. Now it was time for Bond to move from iconic to mythic. It helped that Roger Moore would be playing Bond. He was a known commodity with worldwide name recognition, which is what United Artists wanted, and an actor who would play the part more broadly than either of his two predecessors, using his charm and sense of humour to win over the audience. There were still question marks about his suitability, but at the time of his casting in 1972, those centred around him being primarily known for his television work, with his movies underperforming at the box office. But Eon and United Artists needed him, and he needed something high prestige to work on, so it was a good match. Unlike Lazenby's introduction to audiences of Bond, using familiar tropes such as driving an Aston Martin, wearing a tuxedo and carrying the AR-7 folding rifle in his glove box, followed by an action sequence to establish that this is the new James Bond, Moore's introduction happens after the opening titles and sees him in bed with an Italian secret agent. We get a light-hearted scene between M and Bond, with Moneypenny trying to hide the Italian girl from her boss. This scene is to establish Moore as the character, using only a couple of tropes such as romancing a beautiful woman and using a gadget in an ingenious way, while showcasing Moore's talent for light comedy, without undermining the character. In a way, this is a reverse from Lazenby, where action was meant to sell us the new actor, followed by a witticism. This time around, the wit and charm sells us Moore as Bond, and the action doesn't happen for another couple of scenes. There is a characteristic about James Bond as played by Roger Moore, and that he is far more chaotic and randomly destructive than Connery was during his tenure. Solitaire puts it nicely when we're introduced to her character as she's doing a tarot reading. He brings violence and destruction. Connery and Lazenby was certainly adept at the violence part, but Moore adds the destructiveness of Bond let loose in the world. In Live and Let Die, he's indirectly responsible for cars crashing and destruction of New York City property to the consternation of Felix. He ruins Mrs. Bell's flying lesson and destroys the plane she's in. And then there's the speedboat chase, where police cars are smashed, people's relaxing time by the pool disrupted, and a wedding is ruined. Sheriff J.W. Pepper sums up Bond well. What are you, some kind of doomsday machine? Throughout Moore's films, he's wrecking public places and bringing havoc to the everyday world. Bond doesn't seek this out, but it's as a consequence of his agent's activities. This is part of his mythic status by this point in the film series. He descends into the underworld of the villain's schemes and brings complete chaos until order is restored at the end. This is what mythic heroes have done in literature and religion since society began. Bond is the successor to Marduk, Gilgamesh, Perseus, Theseus, Ulysses, and every mythic hero since then. It is therefore fitting that this mythic, destructive, and chaotic version of James Bond debuts in the only film in the series to dabble with mysticism. Kananga uses the tarot to plan and organise his schemes, to advise him, and to bring order into his criminal and political world. Bond completely subverts that by rigging a tarot deck and sleeping with his mystic in order to remove her powers of insight. Bond villains are usually a fussy, well-ordered lot, and one of Bond's tactics is to upend that order, ruin the opulence and the fine detail of the villain's lair, and bring it all crashing down. Literally. There is only one Bond villain in the entire series who is as chaotic and destructive as 007, and that is Silver, which will make an interesting comparison when I get to analysing Skyfall. On release, the movie was a big hit. It made the transition of actors a success after the criticism Lazenby received when he took over the role of James Bond. Live and Let Die, even with the elements of mysticism and voodoo in the story, didn't reinvent the format. It adjusted things in increments. The lightness of touch that was in Diamonds Are Forever was retained. The lush cinematography harkened back to Dr. No and Thunderball, and the action set pieces were there to dazzle. There was no navel-gazing with Moore's first outing in the role, no need to re-examine the character, as had happened in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It took what was already established in the movie series and dialed it up a little, and over the next few more films, that chaotic, mythic aspect of the character would be at the fore during his tenure, and would echo with his successors. So Eon had found a winning formula within an already winning formula. Hamilton, Mankiewicz, inspiration from the real world, and borrowing from a current hit film genre. That formula would be repeated for the next movie in the series, The Man with the Golden Gun. What could possibly go wrong? This series will return.